The larger end occurred more in populations with pre-existing psychiatric disorders. Psychosis is associated with poorer premorbid functioning, which kind of makes sense. History of psych illness, again, kind of makes sense. And polydrug abuse. So what we're talking about here is a kind of diathesis model where somebody has a pre-existing biological predisposition to psychosis that is uncovered by the chemical and or psychological effects of the drug. A more chemical etiology is that there's a lot of serotonin aggregations. So the hallway in the emergency room is definitely not a place for these people, but they get put there anyway. And if you need to calm them down in the acute phase, benzos and atypicals are again first-line treatment. Here's the part where you get to win a free beer. First guy who can name, or first person who can name this guy gets a free beer. Very good. Very good. So if you come to happy hour, you get a free beverage. This is Syd Barrett, who was one of the founding members of Pink Floyd. I was going to talk a lot about him, but I figured it would be kind of unprofessional, and because nobody really knows what happened with Syd. All we know is that he was one of the founding members of Pink Floyd, and somewhere around 1967 started developing really odd behavior. And God knows why that was, but some people tend to attribute that to lots and lots of acid. So finally, we're going to mosey on to history of use. First, going to talk about psilocybin. Psilocybin was used ritually in Central and South America. There are cave paintings in those areas with mushrooms very prominently displayed, dating back to about 5000 BC. So use of psychedelic intoxicants goes back pretty far in history. There's historical evidence that the Mixtecs and later the Aztecs used psilocybin in their religious rituals. The Aztecs called psilocybin mushrooms teonanacatl. Am I pronouncing that right? Anybody? I'm looking at you, Francisco. Say it for me. Teonanacatl. Okay, cool. So anyways, that translates literally to flesh of the gods, or it was also called the wondrous mushroom. So all this was going on until the Europeans came along, the conquistadors, and they didn't like the looks of anything that was not purely Christian, so they forbid its use among the natives. Nonetheless, the Aztecs continued to use the mushrooms in secret ceremonies, and in the mid-16th century, a monk named Bernardino de Sahagún, I hope I'm saying that one right too, but described an Aztec mushroom ritual in his writings. By the early 20th century, because the mushroom cults, the mushroom religions had gone underground, Americans and Europeans actually debated the existence of psychedelic mushrooms. There was a school of thought that thought that Sahagún had mistaken dried peyote buttons for mushrooms. But in the 1930s, a guy named Robert Whiteliner observed a Mazatec mushroom ceremony, and then it wasn't too long before, in 1955, two guys named Wasson and Richardson were the first white boys to participate in a mushroom ceremony. They went to a woman named Maria Sabina, who was a Mazatec curandera, and she shared with them the secrets of the magic mushroom, which was the name of the 1957 article that Wasson wrote for Life magazine. In that same year, Albert Hofmann isolated psilocybin and psilocin, the active ingredients in psychedelic mushrooms, and invented a technique for synthesizing those chemicals in the laboratory. Now we move on to mescaline, which, as I said, is the active ingredient in peyote cactuses. There's evidence of use of mescaline dating back to 1000 BC, a little further north than psilocybin in the areas that are now Mexico and Texas. But once again, the conquistadors came along and thought that the natives were practicing a kind of witchcraft, so forbid the use of peyote buttons. So it took till 1845 for European botanists to classify peyote. In 1887, this is really interesting, Parke Davis distributed dried peyote buttons for medicinal use. Is there anybody here from Parke Davis today?
Pfizer owns them now.
Oh, really? Oh, I'll have to talk to our Pfizer dudes. Cool. So then in the late 1800s, we saw a spread of peyote use northerly into the mainly Native American populations. In 97, mescaline was isolated by Arthur Hefter, and in 1919, a method was found to synthesize it in the lab. In 1918, the Native American Church was formed. In 1930, there were at least 12 states that outlawed the use of peyote. Across the ocean in Italy in 1931, a guy named Dr. Baroni started using mescaline as an adjunct to psychotherapy. 1953 and 54 saw the publication of Aldous Huxley's Doors of Perception, which of course is Aldous Huxley's first-person account of using mescaline, and he gives some pretty detailed descriptions of his experience. It's a good read if you have some time. In 1960, the federal government gave Native Americans legal access to peyote, which was good because in 67 they banned everybody else from using it. The use of the ergolines now, mainly because this is the only example of hallucinogens being used ritually in the ancestors of Western European civilization. Starting in 1500 BC and lasting until about 300 AD, when again the Christians started getting more heavily involved in Roman politics, there was a ceremony called the Eleusinian Mysteries. This was an annual celebration to honor the goddess Demeter, who was the goddess of the fields and of grain. There was a pretty exclusive invitation list in its 1800 years of life. Attendees at this celebration included people like Homer, Cicero, Aristotle, Plato, Sophocles, Pindar, and Aeschylus. And they would get together for 2 or 3 days and they'd drink something called kaikion, which, judging from what has been written about this and what has been described, was probably a grain-based brew whose hallucinogenic properties were derived from rye ergot fungus. Now we hop ahead a few hundred years to 1943, when a chemist named Albert Hofmann was synthesizing rye ergot derivatives for use in medicine. On April 16th, he accidentally ingested LSD-25, an agent he developed as a blood stimulant for Sandoz. 3 days later, he purposefully ingested LSD, about 250 micrograms. And again, he wrote a really nice account. He went for a bike ride. He rode his bike from like work to home, and to him it took about 5 years to get there. Again, really entertaining reading. So it didn't take too long for the CIA over here in the US to find out that LSD was around and that it had some pretty profound effects on the human mind. So in 1953, the CIA started their MK Ultra experiments. Now, these were not experiments in the usual sense that we think of them these days, because these days, we insist on these things like consent to participate in experiments. The CIA was going around and giving people LSD without their knowledge. That actually resulted in 1 or 2 suicides. So finally, in '63, that kind of stuff was shut down. While the CIA was goofing around, Tim Leary started some more legitimate research work at Harvard. 1962 came around, and once again, Congress started hearing about this LSD stuff and thought that, well, if it's powerful and can be used as a weapon, then we should probably start putting restrictions on it. 1963 is when black market LSD started hitting the streets and the college campuses. It was that same year that Tim Leary was fired from Harvard. He later went on in 1966 to found the League for Spiritual Development, which was based in Millbrook, New York. And by 1970, 1 to 2 million Americans had used LSD. And that leads us into talking about the clinical trials of the 50s and 60s. Back between 1950 and 1960, Stahl, Osmond, and others were using LSD as adjuncts to psychotherapy. Osmond's first reason for doing this was kind of unusual. He was treating alcoholics, and he had noticed in his clinical work that the alcoholics were most likely to abstain permanently from alcohol were those who had been through very violent and severe DTs. So he saw LSD as a way of recreating the DT experience in a safer way than actually putting somebody into DTs. So where things sort of fouled up for Osmond is that he gave his patients the LSD and really tried his hardest to make them have a really bad experience to scare them into not drinking alcohol again. But most of the patients had very positive experiences, and also had tended to have a sort of shift in their paradigm, a shift in their thinking and in their perspective on their drinking, to the point that the subjects who were given LSD tended to do a little better in terms of remaining abstinent than the people who didn't.